I'm going to spend some time talking today about the political regime in Mexico. Hopefully, you will recognize some common threads between our conversation about Mexico's history and the way that its regime has been organized in the post revolutionary era. But I'm also going to spend some more time focusing on just the nuts and bolts of who does what, who has which powers, who checks whom, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start with Mexico's constitution, which is so significant in the political imaginary of the country that apparently in a lot of cities and towns and villages in Mexico, there are streets named not only after the constitution itself, but also after specific articles of the constitution that are viewed as particularly significant. Mexico's current constitution was ratified first in 1917. That marks the conclusion of the Mexican Revolution. Of our case study countries, this is the oldest written constitution that we have. Structurally, you're going to notice a lot of similarities in terms of how the institutions and powers of government are arranged between the Mexican and the United States constitutions. That's not necessarily an accident. The drafters of Mexico's constitution would have been very much aware of the American Constitution and other existing written constitutions. One major difference is that if you read Mexico's constitution, and that's true for most of our case study countries' constitutions as well, you'll notice a lot more explicit language in there about protecting social and economic rights. Part of that might have to do with the idea that in 1917, national governments just have a lot more capacity to provide for social and economic well-being of their people than they did in the late 18th century in the United States. But part of that also directly reflects the demands and the principal goals and ideals of the Mexican Revolution. So, for instance, Article 3 of Mexico's Constitution protects the right to a free primary education. You get that basically everywhere in the United States, but it's not written about anywhere in the United States Constitution. It's not protected at the federal constitutional level. Article, I think, 43, another really big deal one, allows the government to take land away from large landowners and to redistribute it to peasants. And that reflects an attempt to cater to the demands of peasants, particularly in Mexico's south, that they had expressed in participating in the revolution. There's some significant restrictions on the Catholic Church that were written into Mexico's original 1917 constitution because the Catholic Church institutionally had been a fairly conservative force in pre-revolutionary Mexico. And then finally, you'll find a bunch of different articles that offer fairly strong and powerful protections to workers and to labor unions in particular. Some of those things, in particular the restrictions on the church and the provisions about land reform and redistribution, have been dialed back or amended or just not implemented in recent decades. But I think it remains fairly accurate to say that there's a lot of important information in Mexico's constitution that's supposed to convey a commitment to the state to protecting social and economic well-being for ordinary people. It's worth noting that since 1917, Mexico has had this constitution which on paper provides for multi-party rule, for competitive elections, for power sharing, for a transfer of power between parties or elites of different political ideologies. And yet, from 1929 to 2000, as you have already heard me say, a single political party controls political power pretty much up and down throughout Mexico. So one question we should think about is, how is it that this single party, the institutional revolutionary party, the PRI, manages to dominate political competition and political power in Mexico for 71 years? Part of the answer is that they're just genuinely popular, that the PRI does a good job of organizing, of claiming that mantle, of carrying out Mexico's revolution, right? So if they win the legislative elections, if they sweep the legislative elections every cycle, then there's no real need for the legislature to check the executive. They're not going to exercise that power, even though it's written into the Constitution, because they belong to the same party and they want to advance more or less the same agenda. In addition, that electoral dominance means that all the competition happens within the PRI, and that there's a lot less protections for transparency, for competition, et cetera, within the PRI than there are at the state level elections. In later years, you're also going to see outright fraud by the PRI in the 80s and 90s, which is something that, as I said in your history lecture, is really going to undermine the ability of the PRI to hold on to power. It's actually going to lead to the erosion of single party rule. But it's just worth noting that, the democratization of Mexico happens without a total sweeping transformation of the written constitution. Instead, regime change is going to come about. This transition from one party to multi party democracy is going to come about through a combination of formal and informal changes. On the formal constitutional level, in terms of amendments to the Constitution and changes to Mexico's written laws, you're going to see the electoral rules change in a way that's going to make legislative elections much more competitive, much harder for a single party to dominate. You're going to see those checks and balances between different branches of government become much more effective. And in particular, Mexico's judiciary will become much more independent starting in the 1990s. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But you're also going to see some informal changes just in terms of political behavior of people and parties. So the PAN, which is Mexico's longstanding conservative party, and the PRD, which is a newer leftist party that emerges in the 1980s as it splits away from the PRI, those parties are going to start contesting elections, first at the local level and then at the national level in the 80s and 90s. And they're going to start chipping away at that pre-hegemony in those local elections. So the opposition is going to be stronger. And then you're also going to see some amount of what your textbook refers to as democratization from above, which is the PRI saying, actually, we really need to dial it back on the election fraud. We really need to introduce some reforms like independent monitoring and administration of Mexico's elections in order to not totally lose our legitimacy, in order to have any chance whatsoever of maintaining our hold on power, or at least remaining politically competitive in the 21st century. So it's just worth noting that Mexico has these significant changes in regime in the 90s and early 2000s that are not just the result of amendments to the Constitution, but also the result of changes in other rules and in just the way that people behave in Mexican politics. So today, here's where we stand in terms of the formal arrangement of Mexico's regime. Most important person in the executive branch is the president. Currently, you see depicted here, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, known universally as AMLO to save you a bunch of syllables. He is both the head of state and the head of government. This is a presidential system, so the executive and the legislature have separate sources of power. The formal powers of the executive include he can introduce bills directly in the legislature. He has to sign them if they're going to become law. And of course, the president has the right to veto bills that are passed by the legislature if he doesn't want them to become law. The president also, as head of government, directs both executive and foreign policy. So he oversees the cabinet, he oversees the running of Mexico's extensive bureaucracy, and he sets the direction of the country in its relations with other countries. The president can nominate his cabinet members and also remove them. The cabinet is accountable to the president. And finally, the president has the power to nominate Supreme Court justices, which I'll say more about when we get to the judiciary. Under one-party rule, so before 2000, the presidency was an extraordinarily powerful office. And so there are a couple of additional, both formal and informal sources of power for Mexico's president before 2000 that made the presidency so important. Number one, probably most importantly, the president functioned as not just the head of state and head of government for Mexico, but also as the head of the PRI, as the head of his own party. And in a world where one party dominates basically every election, whoever can decide who that party is going to nominate for significant offices is basically going to control the direction of government in the country, even beyond the formal powers of that person's office. At the presidential level, the president's power to nominate his successor, who he's pretty sure is going to win the election because one party always wins the election, is known as the dedazo, which I think literally translates to something like the big finger or the big thumb, as in I'm going to point at you and you're going to be the next president of Mexico. In addition, the president will exercise really significant influence over who the PRI is going to put on the ballot for a bunch of other offices, legislative, executive, et cetera, up and down the ticket in the country. Number two, formally speaking, up until I think the 1990s, Mexico's president had a lot more powers than they do today over appointing judges and removing judges from federal judgeships, not just at the Supreme Court level, but also at circuit court and district court levels. And that gave them significant influence over the judiciary. Finally, Mexico's president had extensive decree powers, and that hasn't formally changed since the end of PRI rule, but the political costs of ruling by decree rather than by legislation corruption have significantly increased as Mexico has become more politically competitive. So, for instance, in 1934, Lázaro Cárdenas, who was a really significant pre-president in Mexico, decreed that he was going to take away assets from foreign-owned oil companies and effectively nationalize Mexico's oil industry. Similarly, in 1982, during a massive financial crisis, most of Mexico's banking industry was taken under state control by a presidential decree. So in a world where the legislature isn't really willing to check the powers of the president because they're both controlled by the same party, then the power to issue decrees is pretty significant. One last thing worth noting is that going up until about the 1980s, the Mexican state had pretty significant involvement in its economy and owned a number of key industries. That remains mostly the case in the oil sector, but Mexico has privatized a number of those other state-owned industries. But before privatization happens, the president and the PRI more broadly often use their control over these state-owned industries to dispense patronage, to reward their supporters, to punish their opponents. So that's the presidency's powers have declined pretty significantly since then, not so much because there have been formal changes, but rather because one-party rule in general has evaporated and parties are much more competitive. It's worth noting, when Andres Manuel López Obrador and his new party Morena took majorities in both the presidential election and the legislature in the 2018 elections, that might call into question everything that I'm saying about competitiveness in Mexican politics. But I'm going to take the classic out here and tell you it's a little bit too early to say that. That said, one constraint on Mexico's president that has been consistent throughout the period of both pre-rule and after is the sexenio. That's the single 6-year term. So there's a concrete ban on re-election, which was one of the major demands of the Mexican Revolution in the first place. Remember, Porfirio Diaz came into power saying, I'm just going to be president one term, and then served as president for quite a few terms. And so that rule of no re-election, consecutive or otherwise, has been obeyed pretty consistently throughout Mexico's post-revolutionary history. I think there's only one president who has been non-consecutively reelected, and the Constitution was amended back immediately after that to make it impossible to do again. Moving to the second branch of government, the legislature, which in Mexico is called, uncreatively from an American perspective, the National Congress. This is a bicameral legislature. Its lower house is called the Chamber of Deputies. That is 500 members. We'll talk about their elections in a second, each of whom serves a 3-year term. They're all elected at the same time. The legislature's powers, the Chamber of Deputies' powers, are going to be very much what you expect them to be if you have any knowledge of American politics, and these are structurally pretty similar constitutions. So they can debate and pass laws. The procedure is the same as you would expect it to be in the United States, where both houses must pass a law in order for it to get sent to the president's desk. He must sign it in order for it to become a law. You can learn about this from Schoolhouse Rock if you're not familiar with this process. The Chamber of Deputies has the unique power to originate bills that are going to levy taxes. In the United States Constitution, we refer to that as the power of the purse. They also have the power to certify election results, which is important given the contested nature of a number of Mexico's elections in the 1980s and 1990s particularly. The upper house of the legislature is called the Senate. It has 128 members. They each serve a 6-year term. And again, we'll talk about electoral systems in a moment. A couple of unique powers of the Senate, in addition to signing or not, or voting up or down on whatever it is that the Chamber of Deputies passes to them. The Senate can confirm Supreme Court justices who are nominated by the president. They can ratify treaties that are signed by the president. And they have the power to approve intervention by Mexico's federal government in matters that are otherwise reserved for Mexico's subnational units of government, its states. Up until 1997, the PRI predictably dominated legislative elections, but in 1997, for the first time in Mexico's post-revolutionary history, since the rise of the PRI, for the first time, a majority in the Chamber of Deputies belonged to political parties other than the PRI. And so that suddenly started this era in which the legislature actually started exercising its powers to check the executive. Then, in the period between 2000 and 2018, ending with the election of AMLO, who has a majority of his own party and his own electoral coalition in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. Before that, you start to see Mexican presidents actually ruling in divided governments where the presidency and the legislature are controlled by different parties. And so the legislature starts actually being able to wield a little bit more influence and bargain with the president as opposed to just rubber stamping whatever the president wants to do. Um, One last power worth noting is that the legislature can impeach cabinet members and Supreme Court justices and the other legislators. There's no explicit provision for presidential impeachment in the Mexican Constitution, and there's some commentators who argue that that really ought to change. Those powers of impeachment work similarly to the way that they do in the U.S. You might know about this because you've lived through at least two impeachments in the United States in your lifetime. The Chamber of Deputies acts as essentially the indicting body, and then the Senate conducts the trial and votes on whether or not to remove the impeached officer from their office. For a long time in Mexico's constitution, that principle of no reelection that we know about with the presidency extended to members of the legislature as well. But you might imagine why it's not necessarily going to produce a super effective legislature if everybody is spending their first year figuring out where the bathrooms are, their second year legislating, and then their third year trying to figure out how to get another job because their term's about to end. And so in 2014, as part of a package of reforms known as the Pact for Mexico, re-election was introduced. And so now members of the Chamber of Deputies can serve up to 4 terms. Members of the Senate can serve up to 2 terms. Let's pause for a second before we get to the judiciary and talk about Mexico's electoral systems. First, and this always surprises Americans, voting is mandatory, not completely unusual in countries outside of the United States. Technically, it's mandatory. Enforcement is not super strict. Turnout in Mexican elections averages less than 60%. So they are not necessarily throwing huge numbers of people in jail every election cycle for not showing up to the polls. But in principle, voting is mandatory. The president is elected through what I think personally is the simplest electoral system in any of our case study countries, which is that everybody votes and whoever gets the most votes wins. In 2000, 2006, and 2012, Mexico's president was elected with much less than a majority. I think the numbers were in the 30%, the 30s for each of those elections, but don't quote me on that. And so it is quite possible to become the president of Mexico with way, way less than majority support. You might want to spend a little time thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of that situation. The Chamber of Deputies and the Senate both have what we call mixed electoral systems, meaning that there's an element of single-member district plurality and there's an element of proportional representation. In the Chamber of Deputies, that's pretty straightforward. Mexico is divided into 300 electoral districts, and one candidate who gets a plurality of votes in each of them wins the seat. And then, in addition, there's some bigger multi-member districts for proportional representation purposes. And the effect of that is going to be to make it relatively difficult for any one party to claim a majority, to make it quite possible for smaller parties such as the Green Party, which consistently gets some representation in Mexico's legislature, to win some seats through those proportional representation elections. The Senate is a little bit complicated. There's a unique system for the state level elections. In each of Mexico's 32 states, there are 3 senators, or rather there's 31 states in the federal district of Mexico City. So there are 96 senators that are elected by state, with 3 representing each state. The way this works is each party that wants to run in a state chooses 2 candidates. The party that gets the most votes in each state gets 2 seats, but then the party that gets the second most votes in that state gets to send 1 senator from their list of nominees in that state. So there's a sort of second place consolation prize baked into this system, which, as far as I know, is pretty unique. In addition, there are 32 more senators elected by nationwide proportional representation, and there's a 2% threshold there. So if your party gets less than 2% of the votes in the nationwide Senate election, you don't get any seats. Gender quotas are another aspect of Mexico's system that are unique, although not uncommon in the context of Latin American politics. Parties are required for the party list when they nominate candidates to nominate at least 40% men and at least 40% women. And the result of that has been that today about 49% of legislators in Mexico are women, which is relatively high compared to countries around the world, which is relatively high compared to our case study countries. So worth noting, that's one way in which you can write a law that explicitly increases representation of women in the results of otherwise democratic elections. It's also one way that proportional representation, because it introduces this party list mechanism, can be good for representation of women or other underrepresented groups in legislatures. Mexico's electoral rules are a little bit complicated. It is not critically important to me that you memorize every single detail, although it's helpful to you if you can. But the important point that you do really need to remember about Mexico's elections is that the rules are designed to make it somewhat difficult to get a majority in the legislature. And this was quite unusual in the post-pre era until 2018, when AMLO's party, Morena, and its electoral coalition actually did gain a legislative majority in 2018, and then they held on to it in the next round of elections in summer 2021. So keep an eye on that. As I've said, a little bit too soon to make an historical judgment on whether Mexico's democracy is going to revert to one-party rule under AMLO. That's what some people, I think, are predicting, but it's way, way too soon to say that. But keep an eye out on those results because we could see another change in our assessment of whether Mexico really has transitioned to a multi-party competitive democracy. One last thing to note about Mexico's elections, but it's a really important one, particularly in explaining that transition from one party to multi party rule. And that's an organization called the INE, the National Electoral Institute. This was established under a slightly different name in 1996, and it's worth noting that's under the period of pre rule. And its job is to directly supervise elections. It took that power away from the Secretary of Government, I think, who was a member of Mexico's cabinet appointed directly by the president. So the members of this institute are appointed by Congress for 9-year terms, which means that their terms don't necessarily overlap any single presidential administration or any single legislative session. And its job is to oversee federal and state and local elections in Mexico. When it's first established, it's called the Federal Electoral Institute. It just oversees federal elections. In 2014, they renamed it to its current name, and they added responsibilities for supervising state and local elections. The goal here is to make elections more transparent and more reliable by taking the administration and supervision of elections out of the hands of a political appointee who is directly answerable to the president of Mexico and putting them into the hands of a much more independent institution that in theory can gain public trust. So the INE is responsible for election supervision. They maintain a list of who is eligible to vote in Mexico at a national level. They're responsible for issuing and verifying voter ID cards. They supervise a system of public funding for elections. Mexico has relatively strict campaign finance rules and much more robust public funding for elections than the United States does. And all of those have combined to make the INE a relatively more trusted institution in the Mexican government. In particular, in both 2006 and 2012, the same dude, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, loses the election and claims that he's been ripped off. He claims that there's been election fraud. And it's partly the relatively high levels of trust in the INE that allow the country to get past that crisis instead of having a massive and enduring dispute about who's the legitimate president. All right, let's move on to the judiciary, the third branch of the government. We'll start with the Supreme Court, highest court in Mexico. Supreme Court has 11 justices. I think in Mexico they're called magistrates, who are appointed by the president or nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. They serve 15-year terms. The Supreme Court functions as the final court of appeal in Mexico, and it also has the power of judicial review, which, as you know, means that they can strike down legislation which they determine to be in conflict with the terms of Mexico's constitution or its laws. Mexico uses civil law, which is a system of law different from what you might be familiar with if you know anything about how the American legal system works. Civil law is what we know as sometimes also called code law. It dates all the way back to these efforts by people like the Emperor Justinian to write down and codify all of the laws in the Roman Empire. But the idea is that the judge's job is not to make law, not so much to interpret law, but more to determine the facts. So they often play a significant investigative role and to apply the law. So civil law gives a much stronger role to legislators in determining what the law is and gives somewhat less discretion to judges, to the judiciary in determining what the law is. That contrast to a system known as common law, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the United Kingdom. It's also in use in Nigeria. It's also in use in the United States. And in general, you'll find common law because it goes back to a bunch of English legal traditions from many centuries back. You'll find common law more widely in use in English-speaking countries that were formerly English colonies. One other institution that's really worth talking about at some length in Mexico is known as the Federal Judicial Council, and this is established in, I think, 1996. The Federal Judicial Council is really responsible for protecting judicial independence in Mexico, and its creation marks a significant step in Mexico's democratization. Its job is to appoint and remove lower court judges. So Mexico, in addition to the Supreme Court, has federal district courts, federal circuit courts at lower levels than the Supreme Court. The appointments and removals of judges to those courts used to be in the hands of the president. They are now in the hands of the Federal Judicial Council. That council has 7 members. The president of the Supreme Court is automatically a member. 3 of those members are appointed by the Supreme Court from lower courts. 2 of those members are appointed by the Senate. 1 of those members is appointed by the president. Their terms are staggered, so it's not possible to become the president and then just replace all of the members of the Federal Judicial Council so that they'll do what you want. Important point here is that the lines of control are varied enough that there is no one person in Mexico who can get their way in the appointment and removal, of lower court judges. So they have the power to appoint lower court judges. They have the power to remove them in cases of misconduct. And again, the big picture importance of this institution is that it removes the judiciary from any one person, from the control of any one person or any one branch of government. The course and exam description, and I think also your textbook, have this kind of enigmatic phrase, and I quote, "Mexico's judicial system is in transition." Best I can figure out about what that means is that in 2008, Mexico introduced a package of reforms which are supposed to go into effect by 2016 in an attempt to change its judicial system and to address some perceived abuses or unfairnesses, particularly for defendants. One really important aspect of those reforms is the shift in the way in which individual court proceedings work. So the previous model, which is also common in many parts of Europe, was that judges really functioned as investigators, and their primary business was conducted in writing. Towards the model that you'll see if you've watched like basically any American courtroom TV drama, in which lawyers for the state versus lawyers for the defendant present their arguments in court. So they're adversarial, they're arguing against each other. The judge's job is to decide whose case is more persuasive, and they do that in speech as well as in writing. So that's a significant shift in just the dynamics of the way that court proceedings work in Mexico. The second major aspect of those reforms was really to try and introduce much more protection for the due process rights of people accused of committing crimes. So things like always having a judge present at proceedings concerning your case, things like limits on pretrial detention, so being able to put a defendant in jail before they've actually been convicted of or pled guilty to anything. All those things were baked into these reforms in 2008. Those reforms were supposed to take effect not just at the federal, but also at the state level by 2016. On paper, that has happened, but the effectiveness of these reforms has been somewhat limited because training judges and lawyers to operate differently costs money, and there's a lot of people who argue that not enough money has been allocated for that purpose. More recently, and the bigger picture sort of set of frustrations with or controversy about Mexico's judiciary is just that, particularly in the context of the drug war and of escalating violence in Mexico, the courts aren't clearing cases at a very high rate. And so in more recent years, there's been a swing back in the other direction. Under AMLO's administration, the government has proposed reforms that would actually take some of those protections away from defendants and give more advantages to prosecutors trying cases. So keep an eye on that. It is an area where we should expect some more significant change and controversy in Mexican politics. Final topic, local government. Mexico is a federal system. It is technically in the name of Mexico. And so power is constitutionally divided between the federal government and subnational units. The subnational units are 31 states. You can see a small map on your screen. And then in addition, the federal district, which is Mexico City. Mexico City has slightly less autonomy than the states, but they do have a directly elected mayor, which is often an important stepping stone to higher political office in Mexico. In general, state and county officials in Mexico are also directly elected as opposed to being appointed. So this is another source of political competition. But it's also worth noting that if your model for a federal system is the United States, Mexican states have much less autonomy than subnational units of government do in the US. The primary reason for that is that they have pretty limited powers to raise revenue. About 90% of all of the tax revenue in Mexico goes to the federal government, not to state or local governments. And if you can't spend money, it's really hard to implement policies. The other issue here is that there's significant concerns about corruption, really at many levels of politics in Mexico, but in particular in areas where drug cartels have significant influence. There's often a lot of concern that local police and local judges are more or less in the pocket of various drug cartels. And sometimes you will see that used as a justification for the federal government coming in and taking over, or at least sharing law enforcement powers with local and state authorities. That's all the information I want to shove in your brains today. I'm going to leave you with just one question to consider, although I'm sure there's a lot more stuff that you could talk about Mexico's regime. And that is this question of how much does democratization depend on changes in written rules? I've tried to split the emphasis in this lecture between formal amendments to Mexico's constitution, so things like creating an electoral institute, creating a federal judicial council, and also changes in just the dynamics of political competition in Mexico, which is a topic that we'll return to on another day. So one thing that I would recommend that you spend a little time thinking about before we next meet is just to what extent does a country's level of democracy depend on how its constitution is written versus to what extent does it depend on how elites and ordinary people behave. That's all for today. Thanks.